Welcome to RPRA's annual public meeting. At this time, all lines are in listen-only mode. To ask a question at any time during the presentation or for technical assistance, please type your question in the text box provided on the screen and press enter. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. I will now turn the webinar over to Glenda Gies, Chair of RPRA's Board of Directors.
Good morning, and welcome to the Authority's annual public meeting. I'm Glenda Gies, Chair of the Authority's Board of Directors, and I will be your MC for today. I'd like to start with two important acknowledgements. First, as you can all appreciate, we are holding today's proceedings virtually due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We would have preferred to meet with you face-to-face as we have in the past, but we hope to be able to deliver our transparency and accountability objectives through this virtual meeting. These are difficult times for all of us, both personally and professionally. I want to express my personal appreciation to all of you for participating in today's proceedings despite these challenges, and I hope that our resilience as individuals and as a community will get us through this public health crisis. I would also like to acknowledge that we are on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. I want to show my respect and honor all Indigenous people who have been living on this land since time immemorial. This acknowledgement is particularly important this morning as we witness the rise of a global movement to end systemic racism in all aspects of our society, in policing, hiring, housing, and environmental policy, to name but a few sectors where structural racism creates deep inequities. This clarion call is a challenge to all of us, including us here at the Authority, to be introspective, to acknowledge our shortcomings, and to do much better. These are momentous times, but also hopeful times that have the potential to affect change for us to be better and stronger as individuals, as a province, and as a country. On behalf of the Authority's Board of Directors, I would like to thank you for joining us via webcast. We have about 200 participants online this morning. Please note that if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, you can click on the Tech Support tab and enter your question or comment into the text box and press enter. Someone from OneCast, our website service provider, is on standby to provide technical support and will respond to you immediately. Similarly, for the Q&A portion of today's proceedings that will follow the presentations, you can click on the Q&A tab and submit a question at any time. Questions will be addressed during the Q&A portion of the meeting. Joining me today are Frank Denton, the Authority's CEO, and Pat Moran, the Authority's Registrar. Frank and Pat will each provide information about the Authority's 2019 activities following my remarks. The Q&A session will then conclude today's proceedings. Excuse me. We have scheduled today's meeting for an hour and a half. We are currently broadcasting from RPRA's head office at Yonge & Sheppard in Toronto. Please be assured that we are practicing social distancing with Frank, Pat, and I each in separate rooms. RPRA staff supporting today's broadcast are with us today in the office and, of course, are also practicing social distancing. As a regulatory authority of the Government of Ontario, we are accountable to the Minister of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, to the public, and to our stakeholders, including all of you online with us today. Our annual public meeting, along with the annual report we published earlier this month, are two key public disclosure and accountability requirements and opportunities for the Authority. Your participation in our annual public meeting allows us to present our activities over the past year, address any questions you may have, and ensure both transparency and accountability for our activities. I encourage you to use the Q&A tab to submit any questions you may have about the Authority's activities over the past year at any time during these proceedings. We will do our best to answer those questions during the Q&A portion of the meeting. Since the Waste Free Ontario Act became law in November 2016, establishing the Authority, The transformation in the way we manage waste in Ontario laid out in the Act is well underway. We are moving from a system based on collective producer responsibility delivered by industry funding organizations to a system based on producers being individually responsible and accountable for their products and packaging at end of life. This evolution is another step in Ontario's history of innovative approaches to reducing waste and litter. The transition to individual producer responsibility will provide more choice to businesses in how their products and packaging are collected and managed once consumers dispose of them. It will spur innovation, and ultimately it will increase Ontario's recycling rate and reduce the amount directed to disposal. These are all outcomes we are beginning to see in the tire sector after a full year of individual producer responsibility for tires. As you will hear in greater detail from Frank and Pat, we experienced positive engagement between the authority and the tire sector throughout the past year as we collaborated to share information and educate registrants and stakeholders about the tires regulation. This resulted in high levels of compliance, the emergence of a competitive market for compliance services with multiple producer responsibility organizations being established, and early indications of innovation being introduced into the tire processing market with new technologies being deployed. Our experience with the tires regulation over the past year provides a blueprint for our collaborative approach to implementing future regulations under the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. In addition to the positive outcomes in the used tire sector under the tires regulation, 2019 also saw momentum in the transition of Ontario's remaining legacy waste diversion programs. The authority approved the wind-up plan for the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Program and Ontario Electronic Stewardship, the industry funding organization responsible for administering the program. This program will end on December 31st, 2020, and we anticipate that Ontario Electronic Stewardship will be dissolved next year. Starting January 1st of 2021, electronics will be subject to individual producer responsibility requirements that will be laid out in the electronics regulation, expected to be released soon. The authority also approved the wind-up plan for the Municipal Hazardous or Special Waste Program, which will end on June 30th, 2021. The batteries portion of the MHSW program is set to wind up first, next week in fact, on June 30th, and transition to individual producer responsibility requirements outlined in the batteries regulation will start on July 1st. By this time next year, we will have 3 of Ontario's legacy collective producer responsibility programs wound up and transitioned to the new regulatory framework for resource recovery: tires, electronics, and municipal hazardous or special waste. Last August, the Minister directed the windup of the 4th and final legacy program, the Blue Box program, and Stewardship Ontario, the industry funding organization responsible for operating both the Blue Box program and portions of the MHSW program. The windup of the Blue Box program will occur between January 1st, 2023 and December 31st, 2025. Stewardship Ontario will be dissolved the following year. While each program transition presents an important milestone in the province's waste management history, the windup of the Blue Box program will represent a crossroad in Ontario's journey to a waste-free future. As the largest and most complex of the 4 legacy programs and the one Ontarians interact with most often, the windup of the Blue Box program will have the most meaningful impact in accelerating Ontario's circular economy. 2019 also saw the authority's mandate changed by the Ontario government to allow it to deliver a registry and reporting services for other waste and resource recovery programs beyond producer responsibility initiatives. The Ontario government has proposed the Hazardous Waste Program for industrial hazardous waste as the first program with a registry and reporting services provided by the authority. This change to the authority's mandate will allow it to leverage its experience and expertise in establishing and building the tires registry and supporting registrants in understanding and complying with new regulatory requirements and processes. We are appreciative of the Ontario government's confidence in the authority to deliver this mandate and have initiated the planning work to build the registry and reporting service for the hazardous waste program, which will be available starting January 1st, 2022. Since the authority was established in November 2016, we have exercised our legislative mandate deliberatively, diligently, and cost-effectively. We have successfully transitioned one legacy waste diversion program, tires, to the new individual producer responsibility regulatory framework and are in the process of transitioning two more, municipal hazardous or special waste, starting with batteries next week, and electronics. We have begun the process of overseeing the development of the wind-up plan for the Blue Box program, and we have been mandated to build and operate a registry and reporting service for tracking industrial hazardous waste. The authority's accomplishments to date, and especially over the past year, could not have been achieved without effective governance. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the board of directors for their commitment and counsel, which have been critical in guiding the authority in effectively and efficiently delivering its mandate over the past year. In particular, I'd like to thank Nidhi Tandon and Joyce Barretto, who departed the board last November after serving with distinction over the previous 3 years. Both Nidhi and Joyce were appointed to the authority's initial board, and their astute and insightful advice supported the authority through its first 3 formative years. Recently, in May, the minister appointed Christine Beaumais to the authority's board, and I'm pleased to introduce her to you, though I suspect many of you know her already from her work with Walmart and Canadian Stewardship Services Alliance. I would also like to thank the authority's executive team and staff for their dedication and commitment to the organization's legislative mandate, cost control, and effective service delivery. As a modern regulator, the authority approaches compliance as a shared responsibility with its regulated parties and its stakeholders. I'd like to thank all the businesses, industry associations, municipalities, and environmental groups who engaged and collaborated with us to support our work in fulfilling the authority's mandate. And I would like to thank Minister Jeff Urich, his office staff, and the team at the ministry for their guidance and support for the authority's work and for their commitment to advancing Ontario's circular economy. The year ahead is clearly fraught with many issues as we continue to wage a collective battle against the COVID-19 pandemic. These extenuating circumstances are creating extreme challenges across all dimensions of our lives, including health, social, and of course, economic. As a regulatory authority, we are committed to both our legislative mandate and to supporting our registrants and stakeholders. As you'll hear more from Pat later, we are taking a flexible approach to compliance where possible to give our registrants additional opportunities to meet their regulatory obligations during the COVID-19 pandemic. I look forward to your continued engagement and support as we each contribute to Ontario's progress towards a waste-free future. I'd now like to invite Frank to provide further details on our work in 2019.
Thank you, Glenda. And thanks to all of you who are attending our first virtual annual public meeting. I sincerely hope this will be the last. It's hard to believe that the last time we did this, it was in a large social gathering in downtown Toronto. I want to begin by acknowledging also how deeply affected we all are by the pandemic, and I want to note that we all know that these impacts are much greater for some of us than for others. I hope you and your families are safe, healthy, and economically secure. We've all been reminded of the fragility of the well-being so much of us enjoy in Ontario. Also, we're all called upon to recognize yet again the injustices inherent in our way of life due to systemic racism. It does feel strange to be back in the office. I haven't been here since mid-March, except once a week ago when we did a dry run of this meeting. We were designated by the province as an essential service, so we are permitted to work in the office, but we have been completely virtual since March the 17th. Like many businesses, it took a little time to get used to, but we were well set up with our technology and found we have been able to deliver our mandate efficiently and effectively under our work from home conditions. This meeting has the same objectives as our past in-person annual meetings, to present our accomplishments and financial performance over the past year and address any questions that you may have. This will be the 4th year since we were established in November 2016. I will focus on what we accomplished in 2019 and how we did it and outline our current priorities. The government's plan for changes to Ontario's resource recovery sector is having big impacts on producers, service providers, municipalities, and less visibly on consumers. The government's goal is to transition Ontario to a model that enables more products and packaging to be collected, reused, recycled, and reintegrated back into production within a circular economy. This will have profound economic and environmental outcomes. Our role as a regulatory authority in this transformation is defined in our legislated mandate. Essentially, we're here to implement the government strategy. We're accountable to the Minister for Environment, Conservation and Parks. Everything we do flows from legislation, regulations, our operating agreement with the Minister, and the directions we receive from the Minister. As an administrative authority, our operations are funded through fees that we charge to the businesses we regulate. We do not receive any funding from the government. There are 2 broad aspects to our mandate. First, we oversee the wind-up of the waste diversion programs under the and the industry funding organizations that run those programs under the Waste Diversion Transition Act. Under our oversight, the used tire program wound up on December 31st, 2018. Ontario tire stewardship will wind up once all outstanding financial and tax issues are resolved. As Glenda noted, the remaining legacy programs are in the process of winding up as directed by the Minister. The Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Program, operated by OES, and Municipal Hazard or Special Waste Program, and the Blue Box Program, both operated by Stewardship Ontario. The second part of our mandate is to enforce the requirements of individual producer responsibility regulatory framework outlined in the RRCEA and its regulations, and to develop and maintain an online registry to receive information from the parties obligated to register with the authority. We do this by supporting businesses in understanding their regulatory requirements so they can comply with the law as easily as possible, and we do this by undertaking enforcement activities to ensure compliance. We focus on engagement, consultation, communications, and education. As Glenda outlined in her opening remarks, 2019 saw Ontario's Circular Economy Initiative ramp up with the authority's approval of the wind-up plans for WE and MHSW. The Minister's direction last summer to wind up the Blue Box program provided further momentum to advancing towards Ontario's circular economy. The work that occurs between the Minister's wind-up directions and the authority's approval of an IFO's wind-up plan is complex. It's largely based on collaboration between the authority and the IFO. It also requires extensive consultation with stewards, service providers, municipalities, industry associations, First Nations, and other stakeholders. The transition of waste diversion programs from collective producer responsibility to individual producer responsibility requires close consideration of potential conflicts of interest. A key objective of working with the IFOs is to manage conflict of interest. This is to ensure the wind-up of IFOs does not give national service providers who deliver those programs on behalf of the IFOs any unfair advantage following transition to a competitive market. For all 4 wind-up directions we've received, conflict of interest has been one of the first and most important areas of focus. I'd like to thank Linda Kitamura, formerly of OES, for working closely with the authority's transition team led by Jeff Rathbone. She helped us develop a robust conflict of interest mitigation plan to ensure fair competition following wind-up of the electronics program. As part of this conflict of interest program, Glenda is no longer with OES. I would also like to thank Gemma Zucchini and her team for their work with Stewardship Ontario and our transition team to develop and implement a conflict of interest plan that will support competition following the wind-up of both the MHSW and the Blue Box programs. Collaboration with OES and Stewardship Ontario has allowed us to take the necessary steps to fulfill the Minister's directions to wind up the electronics program by the end of this year, wind up the batteries portion of MHSW by the end of this month, and the remainder of MHSW by the end of June 2021. We learned that many of our stakeholders are understandably reserving judgment on both the transitions that are underway and on the authority's service delivery and effectiveness in the last year. We undertook a broad-based survey of our stakeholders, including many of you. As a recently established administrative authority enforcing a new regulatory framework, we learned that we need to do more to familiarize our stakeholders about our role as a regulator, and in particular how it differs from the policymaking role of the government and the service delivery role of producer responsibility organizations. We heard how important reducing administrative burden is, especially in your interactions with the registry. This includes operating at a reasonable cost to the businesses who pay our fees. These insights compel us to continue focusing on delivering clear communications, enhancing the usability of our registry, and delivering a compliance function that is robust, fair, and consistent. As we increased our activities last year within our expanding mandate in response to government directions, our costs necessarily increased. Every decision that increases costs has been tied directly to the directions we've received. Under our operating agreement with the Minister, our budget must be divided between activities related to the Waste Diversion Transition Act and activities related to the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. With the transition of the first program to the RRCEA, our RRCEA expenses in 2019 grew to $1.8 million compared to $837,000 in 2018. RRCEA expenses are recovered through fees charged to tire producers and pros. With multiple wind-up processes underway in 2019, our WDTA expenses grew to $5.7 million compared to $5.1 million in 2018. Our WDTA expenses are recovered through fees charged to IFOs and industry stewardship organizations. The increase in our expenses of approximately $1.5 million in 2019 compared to 2018 was due to higher registry expenses, including amortization of registry assets, loan interest related to registry financing, registry support activities, additional staffing expenses, and additional rent and capital asset amortization. In 2019, the authority recognized $2 million in RRCEA fees charged to tire producers and pros, of which $1.8 million was used to finance the tires registry development and compliance activities related to the tires regulation. The remaining $200,000 will be used to reduce this year's registry fees for tires. RRCEA fees represent approximately 24% of the authority's revenues. WDTA revenues from IFOs and ISOs were $6.1 million last year, including the reserve contribution, compared to $5.6 million in 2018. The authority's revenues exceeded expenses in 2019 in order to continue to build a reserve fund, which is consistent with organizational best practices. We ended the year with a total reserve of $3 million compared to $2.4 million in 2018. The authority's reserve policy sets the reserve at no more than 50% of its annual operating budget. Additional details on our financial and operational performance can be found in our 2019 annual report. We posted this on our website just a few weeks ago. The report includes the performance of the waste diversion programs we currently oversee and our corporate scorecard. As Pat's going to discuss in a couple of minutes, the wind-up of the used tire program at the end of 2018 and the first full year under the tires regulation in 2019 was broadly successful. We measure its effectiveness in facilitating a smooth wind-up of the used tire program with minimal disruption in the supply chain for tire collection management, by the emergence of a competitive market for pro-compliance services under the new competitive framework, by the downward pressure on the unit cost of collecting, reusing, and recycling used tires, and by the first indications we're seeing of innovation in the tires processing market. We're optimistic that Ontario will see similar outcomes in the wind-up and transition of the other legacy waste diversion programs. The lessons we learned implementing the tires regulation will inform our approach to implementing the batteries regulation starting July 1st and the electronics regulation starting next January, as well as the regulation for the remaining hazardous and special waste materials. These outcomes are achievable only through ongoing engagement across a broad and diverse group of stakeholders, starting with those in industry and municipal government. We're appreciative and thankful for the collaboration we've enjoyed over the last year. I want to thank the board for their continued guidance. I want to thank my executive management team for their leadership, and I want to thank all the staff at the authority for their hard work and dedication to delivering on our mandate. I'd also like to acknowledge staff at the ministry for their ongoing support and partnership and guidance in delivering on the minister's expectations. In closing, I'd like to echo Glenda's sentiments. We're living through challenging times. The economic impact of the pandemic has been profound. The challenges are great. I very much hope that we will be in person for next year's annual public meeting. At the authority, we're doing everything we can to support businesses through our approach to delivery. We look forward to continued dialogue as we collectively find our way through the present times and progress towards a circular economy. I'm hopeful that Ontario's economic and social strengths, the ingenuity of businesses like yours, and our individual resilience will see us through these times. Now I'd like to invite Pat Moran, the authority's registrar, to speak. Pat, over to you.
Well, thank you, Frank, and good morning to everyone. As you heard from both Glenda and Frank, 2019 was the first full year under the tires regulation. 30 years ago, used tires were accumulating in stockpiles across Ontario, and the Hagersville stockpile being the largest, and you can see in the slide a picture of the Hagersville tire fire. This is what used tire management looked like at that time. The Hagersville tire fire was the spark that initiated the journey that has taken us to the first performance year under the tires regulation. In the aftermath of that fire, the ministry moved to establish and enforce regulations to reduce the risk of another fire, given that there were continuing stockpiles all over the province. Then the ministry focused on processes to reduce the stockpiles, which led to the establishment of the Ontario Tire Stewardship and the Used Tires Program. OTS was successful in eliminating virtually all of the tire stockpiles across Ontario, and was successful in implementing a system of collecting and managing used tires, a system that was paid for by tire stewards. And finally, the ministry moved from a centrally managed model under OTS to the current individual producer responsibility model that we see under the tires regulation. This is what used tire management looks like today. We have tire processors and we have tire retreaders, and as you can see, people are working and contributing to the Ontario economy in a way that wasn't possible 30 years ago. Starting on January 1st of last year, tire producers became individually responsible and accountable for the collection and management of used tires, with the authority having regulatory responsibility for enforcing those requirements. 30 years ago, 14 million tires went up in smoke. 30 years later, 14 million tires were collected and processed into new products or retreaded for continued use in 2019. We now have a robust used tire management system in place with 5 producer responsibility organizations, 20 processors, 14 retreaders, 173 tire haulers, and over 7,000 tire collectors, all providing services to 454 registered tire producers. Together, we have demonstrated that by working collectively, we could unwind a collective waste diversion program with minimal operational disruptions. We demonstrated that we could introduce competition in the compliance services market and spur innovation in the tire processing sector. We got there because Ontario's tire producers are committed to meeting their resource recovery obligations under the tires regulation, and they've clearly demonstrated that. We got there because the pros, the haulers, the collectors, processors, and retreaders are committed to making the transition to a competitive market and delivering the services necessary for producers to meet their obligations. And again, they have demonstrated that in the course of 2019. And finally, we got there because of our strong team of inspectors and our communications team and their commitment to delivering effective communication to our registrants to make sure that they understood their regulatory obligations and how to comply with them. This collective effort has resulted in an excellent level of compliance being achieved over the course of 2019 under the tires regulation. More specifically, in terms of the support that the authority gave to program participants, 6,000 emails were exchanged between tire registrants and our compliance and registry officers. 3,000 phone calls from our stakeholders were fielded. 2,000 proactive calls were made by our staff to help people understand their compliance obligations. In total, over 12,000 unique interactions primarily focused on explaining the new regulatory requirements. We also issued 8 compliance bulletins, which provided detailed guidance on how to meet the regulatory requirements, written in plain English to explain simply and clearly what registrants needed to do to comply. We also established partnerships with industry groups like the Ontario Tire Dealers Association, other regulators like the Ontario Motor Vehicle Industry Council, and municipalities and their association, AMO, to amplify our communications and hold information sessions to help their members learn about the new requirements for collecting and managing used tires. We held extensive consultations on the development of audit procedures to meet the requirements for audits under the tires regulation and to make sure that we were simplifying the ability of registrants to meet those audit requirements and avoiding the imposition of requirements that would cause unnecessary administrative burden in their application. And we launched the Circular Economy Learning Series to provide seminars, initially in person and now online, as educational opportunities for our registrants to learn about the new regulatory framework and our approach to implementation and compliance. This approach, collaborative in nature, educational in focus, and primarily utilizing communications, is the foundation of our compliance strategy. We call it communicating for compliance, and at its essence is our belief that regulated parties want to comply and that what's really required is clear, concise, and accessible information on how to comply. And our experience has been that when people have this information, matched with their desire to comply, they do comply. And that explains the success we've had so far in the TIRES program. This approach is not only successful in achieving high compliance outcomes, it has the added benefit of costing a lot less than deploying enforcement tools after the fact. We want to help people get into compliance now rather than catch them out of compliance later. And most importantly, this process builds trust and goodwill, the key elements necessary to cultivate a sense of shared responsibility for achieving regulatory objectives between the regulator and the regulated parties. However, we have not relaxed our priority compliance objective, ensuring a level playing field. The people that follow the rules, the people that register and report accurately, are entitled to the assurance that everyone is being held to the same standard. They want to know that their competitors do not get an unfair advantage in the marketplace by avoiding their compliance responsibilities. That's why we undertook 2 major compliance campaigns throughout 2019 that focused on free riders. In the first campaign, our inspectors reviewed each of the 454 tire producer accounts that have been established in our registry. As a result of that process, we identified over 100 instances of tire producers who underreported their supply data. This meant that their resource recovery targets were lower than they should have been, and that they would not be doing their share of the work required to manage used tires in Ontario, and therefore not bearing their fair share of the cost to do so. So we corrected that. All 100 of those instances have now been brought into compliance. We also found 70 producers that had overreported their supply data through errors in data submission, meaning that their targets were higher than they should have been, and we've corrected that as well. So that was the first campaign we carried out to deal with free riders. The second campaign, in that campaign, we focused on identifying producers that didn't register at all. Using our own market research and following up on tips that we received, we looked into over 100 cases, and in those cases, we identified 37 free riders who are now registered. And I talked a few minutes ago about how OTS had eliminated virtually every stockpile in Ontario, and I want to close the loop on that one because as part of the 2019 performance year, we also ended up being able to address the last legacy stockpile in Ontario, located in Algoma in Sault Ste. Marie. An RFP was issued to remove that large stockpile of tires that had, for various reasons, remained on site. And once questions of how this would work in conjunction with the tires regulation were resolved, E-Trax, and I have their permission to mention their name, undertook the project of removing and processing those tires, which is expected to be completed this month. So all in all, we had a very successful rollout in the first year of the batteries program. We are now already implementing our C4C strategy for the transition of the batteries program to the new individual producer responsibility requirements that come into effect at the beginning of next week under the batteries regulation. We've already reached out to battery producers, service providers, and to confirmed and potentially interested producer responsibility organizations to explain the requirements of the new regulation. We have followed that up with a general webinar to provide a broad overview of the batteries regulation, and we launched a new circular economy learning series initiative called Ask the Registrar, which is a series of 4 webinars that allowed our stakeholders to engage with me and my team to ask specific and detailed questions about the new regulation. We also held a webinar for producers to do a deeper dive into the regulatory requirements from a producer perspective. As we did with the tire producers, we plan to reach out to each battery producer ahead of the November 30 registration deadline and to have a one-on-one conversation with each one of them about the new requirements. And of course, we will be implementing a similarly robust enforcement strategy as we did in the tires program following registration to ensure that a level playing field is established for battery producers as well. I share Frank's anticipation that this time next year we will be reporting similarly positive outcomes in the batteries program as we have seen in the tires program based on our C4C compliance strategy. And of course, we are going to implement this approach to all other transitions as we continue preparations for the windup of the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment program, which happens at the end of this year, and the remainder of the MHSW program, which takes place next year. After a full year under the tires regulation, we have also learned some important lessons in the design and operation of our registry system, the portal and database that we use to register obligated parties and to receive supply data and performance data reports. As the primary tool that allows us to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements, the registry's design and usability is key to the success of the individual producer responsibility regulatory framework. Our experiences with the tires registry over the past year will inform how we build the batteries registry and plan for the electronics registry and the registry for the industrial hazardous waste program that the ministry has asked us to take over. Those lessons will also guide our approach to enhancing the foundational elements of the registry. As part of our continuous improvement approach last year, we introduced an integrated communication system to the registry. This tool will allow us to deliver better targeted and timed communications to our registrants and stakeholders, which will ultimately allow us to deploy our communication for compliance strategy more effectively. We are indebted to many partners for our achievements last year, and I would like to start by thanking ministry staff, the authority's board, the executive management team here at the authority, all of our staff, and especially my colleagues in the compliance and registry team for their tireless efforts for this past year. I would like to thank the many players in the tire sector, including the Ontario Tires Dealer Association, the Ontario Motor Vehicle Industry Council, and the Association of Municipalities of Ontario for their support. And I also want to note that Glenn Maidment has announced his retirement at the end of this year as head of the Tire and Rubber Association of Canada. Glenn, I'm not sure if you're listening in on this, but I want to say that you have made a major contribution to the evolution of used tire management in Ontario that has provided a solid foundation for our program, and I want to thank you for that, and for all of the people that worked with you, and to wish you an equally successful retirement. I look forward to the work that lies ahead implementing the batteries regulation that starting next week, and the electrical and electronic equipment regulation, and the hazardous or special waste regulation next year, along with the hazardous waste program registry that will also open next year, and the related electronic manifesting system that goes along with that program, which will go online on January 1st, 2022. Finally, I want to say that as a regulator, we will continue carrying out our legislative mandate. However, we intend to exercise our compliance discretion to ensure that we operate with flexibility in order to support our registrants to the extent that we can through these challenging times. Already, we have extended some of our reporting and fee payment deadlines, and we will continue monitoring the COVID-19 pandemic to see what additional flexibility and support we can offer our registrants. On a personal note, I want to thank everybody who has participated in the process of working at home and engaging in social distancing. My daughter is a nurse on a COVID floor for the last 3 months, and I can tell you from her perspective, your efforts meant that the health system did not get overwhelmed by this virus, and your efforts protected her. So on that personal note, I just want to thank everybody for doing what we all needed to do during these difficult times. Thank you again for participating in our annual public meeting, and at this point I'd like to turn the proceedings back to Glenda to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you, Pat. At this time, I'm opening up the question and answer portion of the authority's annual public meeting. Just as a reminder, to pose a question, you can click on the Q&A tab on your screen and type your question into the text box and then press enter to submit the question. We will do our best to answer your questions, but if Frank, Pat, or I do not have the answer readily available, or if your question is specific to your particular situation, we will follow up with you following the meeting. So we have a couple of questions, and Pat, these are both for you. The first one relates to the tires regulation, and you've talked about that, but this question is asking how the authority will report on tire performance next year. They're interested in format and level of detail. If you could comment on the performance reporting by the tire producers and when the authority will be providing that information.
Thank you, Glenda. So the registry process for reporting on performance reporting has been constructed and is available. It will open we're anticipating that it will open on September 1st for performance reporting. In advance of that, we will be sending out communications so that people will understand what it is that they have to do when they go into the registry to report performance reporting. We know that the majority of the performance reporting, if not all of it, is going to be done by the producer responsibility organizations on behalf of their producer customers. And currently, it is our understanding that individual producers will not be doing their own reporting because they've retained a pro to do that. We work closely with the pros all the time. We have regular meetings with them, and when performance reporting is available, we will make sure that the pros are fully up to speed on everything that they have to do in order to achieve the objective.
Thank you. The next question is also for you, Pat, and this relates to the electronics regulation. We know that that program is scheduled to transition on at the end of this year. January 1st, 2021 is the date that the electronics regulation takes effect. This person is asking whether you're concerned that there's not sufficient time for the marketplace to digest the final e-regulation when it is released in order to accommodate the wind-up and transition process. Could you comment on your views, provide your views?
Yes, so the ministry has released a draft regulation for the purposes of public consultation. It's our understanding that consultation on that regulation has been continuing for the last several months, and will be wrapped up shortly. We're all anticipating with the release of the electronics regulation. In the meantime, we certainly recognize that that people who have to comply with that new regulation need the opportunity to understand what their obligation is under those regulations. We know that this regulation in concept is very similar to the tires regulation and very similar to the batteries regulation. And so we've been focusing on helping people to understand those basic concepts and what those will mean in practice, with the details to be confirmed once the regulation is put into place. We will also be taking a transitional approach to implementing the new regulation, recognizing that it may take a number of producers and service providers some time to make the commercial transition that's required to meet those requirements. We did this successfully with tires. The transition for the marketplace took many months into the performance year, but we got there, and ultimately performance worked out well, and we're going to take the same approach with electronics. Our primary objective during the transitional period is to ensure and support a successful transition. Again, based on the proposition that we know the vast majority of businesses who become subject to a regulation, they want to comply with their requirements, and they want to understand them in order to comply, and we will be very focused on making that happen, including being flexible with respect to the time that might be needed to adjust to these new requirements.
Thanks, Pat. The next question is, I think, best addressed by Frank, and it has to do with the timeline for transitioning the Blue Box program. This person is asking whether it's possible for the authority to consider pausing the Blue Box transition given the economic impact of COVID-19.
Thanks. Pausing transition would be a decision taken by the minister. We received direction in August of last year, and we are obligated to follow that direction, so that would be something the minister would consider. And we would take that direction if it comes.
Thanks. The next question is for Pat. This relates to a concern raised by a stakeholder around the disclosure of information about we steward contact information and we service provider contact information to other parties, to external parties. This person is concerned that this is a breach of the WDTA and the authority's access and privacy code. Pat, could you comment on that?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start by saying that at no time did we release any private or commercially sensitive business information. What we did is we organized already publicly available information for the purposes of supporting the transition under the E regulation. We've already done this successfully for the tires regulation and for the batteries regulation. A key component of each of these transitions is the fact that once the IFO is no longer delivering the program, the obligation of producers under the regulations, under all of those regulations, is met by service providers in a competitive market. And so it's key that for that transition to that competitive market, for us to support that competitive market by making sure that information that's maybe not readily accessible becomes readily accessible in order to allow people to compete for that business. We know that the national service provider who's currently contracted to operate the WE program on behalf of the Ontario Electronic Stewardship has publicly indicated its own intention to become a producer responsibility organization under the new regulation. And by virtue of that relationship, RPRA already currently has easy access to the business contact information held by Ontario Electronic Stewardship. And we've determined, which is entirely consistent with the direction of the minister that was issued to OES, that those who are intending to become pros under the new regulation, that they should have access to the same business contact information in order to maintain a level playing field and ensure competition in a free market. Business contact information was released to the stakeholders, as I said, to ensure fair competition during that transition and to support that transition. Individual producers under that regulation have a learning curve to go up, and one of the ways that that learning curve is addressed is by making sure that they have access to the range of choices that they currently don't have under the existing program, but will have once the program transitions under the regulation. Business contact information has never been protected information. In fact, it's expressly excluded from protected information under the Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy Act, and for obvious reasons. Business information is freely disseminated publicly on people's websites, in their advertising, on their stationery, on their email footers, in their LinkedIn accounts, in their regulatory filings. Everywhere this information is available. The issue here is how easy is it for a new market participant to gather that information on its own when it's already conveniently gathered in the hands of OES, and we've simply said that it's already here, and here it is for you as well, and it's easier for you to get access to it since you can already get access to it anyway. So that's what we've done, and of course we know that under each regulation, producers will be providing commercially sensitive information and market supply information, and we are going to safeguard that like Fort Knox. That information does not get released to anybody. We've designed the registry to ensure that the only people who have access to that information is the producer who put it in and the compliance officers who need to look at it for compliance purposes. So the WDTA does not protect information that's already publicly available, but it definitely protects information that needs to be protected, and we are fully committed to ensuring that information that has to be protected continues at all times to be protected. We've operated on that basis from day one under the tires regulation, and we will continue to operate that way.
Thanks, Pat. We haven't received any other questions from stakeholders, but I would remind them if they have questions to please submit them. And while we give them a few more minutes to submit their questions, Frank, you presented in your presentation some information on the authority's expenses and revenues in 2019. And I do know that many stakeholders have concerns about the costs that the authority incurs, and I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on why those costs have increased year over year, what those costs increases represent, and the efforts that you and your staff undertake to ensure cost control.
Sure. So our expenses have increased year over year. Our staff complement has increased year over year. And those increases have been to enable us to implement a mandate which has grown year over year. We've had 4 directions to transition. We have been given an additional mandate beyond originally contemplated to implement a digital reporting service for hazardous waste. We are hiring and spending as we need to be prepared to deliver on that mandate. We had 30 staff by the end of 2019. In 2020, we expect that we'll have about 40 staff. We've been consistently under budget and understaffed relative to budget and forecasts. We hope to do that going forward, but we will always resource at the minimum necessary to reasonably meet our service obligations to the minister.
Thanks. I did receive one additional question, and this relates to the Stewardship Ontario arbitration on the 2019 steward obligation that had been set by the authority board. Two aspects to that. First of all, was the arbitration award posted? And I can say that yes, it is posted on the authority website. And Frank, can you summarize the outcome of that arbitration?
Sure. So that was initiated in 2018 by Stewardship Ontario. A decision recently came down from the arbitrator. There were 3 elements of our methodology that were contested. Number 1, the authority's inclusion of a steward cost containment fee, which relates to the steward's responsibility for cost increases on the system due to their product and packaging choices. Secondly, the authority's inclusion of costs related to materials not defined as printed paper and packaging, in other words, non-obligated. And thirdly, the authority's inclusion of the cash value of in-kind advertising contributions. So by far the largest monetary amounts at stake were the first 2 issues, and the arbitrator upheld the board's decision-making on the steward cost containment and on the non-obligated issue. On the inclusion of cash value for in-kind advertising, the arbitrator directed that this cost be excluded, contrary to the authority's decision. So that results in an adjustment of approximately $1.1 million out of the total 126 million steward obligation that was set in 2019.
Thank you. I have another question. This one's for Pat. How does the registry and reporting system for the industrial hazardous waste system impact tire, battery, and electronics programs?
So the authority operates on a cost recovery basis, and the basic principle of cost recovery is the person that causes the cost pays the cost. So the cost of the tires registry is paid by tire registrants, the cost of the electronics registry is paid by electronics registrants, and so on. And the cost of the registry for hazardous waste and the manifesting system will be paid by the users of that system. So there will be no impact, other than one that's positive, which is that we will be leveraging across all of these programs the fixed foundational common elements of the registry. And of course, the more people there are to cover that cost, the less individual programs will have to pay in relation to those common elements. So the primary impact that we would be anticipating is that on an individual program basis, some costs will go down because they're being shared across more programs. But that would really be the only impact that I would be able to identify.
Thank you. I have one additional question. When will the 2020 Blue Box steward obligation be finalized? And I'll actually answer that question because that a staff report and a staff recommendation will be coming to the board on the 2020 steward obligation over the summer. So you will have that information by the end of the summer, certainly by September at the latest. I don't see any other questions coming in. We'll just give them a bit more time. Perhaps I would ask each of you, starting with Frank, to comment on how the authority is supporting our registrants during COVID-19.
So the most important thing I would say that we're doing is communicating. We're trying to keep our communications simple, timely, and on point on a need-to-know basis. We know that the businesses who rely on us have a lot going on in their businesses, and so we are trying to do everything we can to make it as simple as possible to understand what their relationship is with us and what they need to do to prepare for and be in compliance with the regulations in place or the regulations that are coming. Pat, you could, I'm sure, add to that.
Yeah, sure. I can specifically. We know that tire people had to report on performance by May 31st, and we extended that deadline to October 31st. And it was partly to accommodate the fact that auditors were operating in the context of COVID, and at the same time operating on the basis of a lot of year ends for a lot of companies. And so this was a challenge, and we thought, well, the easiest thing for us to do is just let people wait until the fall to report on performance reporting rather than have them do it by May 31st. And we extended the tire producers supply reporting as well. And once the fees process for registry fees has been completed, we'll open up the registry for that reporting service, and we'll set a deadline for completing it based on where we are at that time on COVID.
Thank you. I do have a question asking how First Nations and small municipalities with less than 5,000 residents will be included in the new individual producer responsibility program for blue box materials. And this is a question that no one here at the authority is able to answer. This is a question that should be put to the ministry. They are developing the regulation for blue box materials, and that regulation will answer that question. So I would encourage you to speak with folks at the ministry on this question. I'm seeing no other questions at this point. Perhaps while we're waiting, giving folks a few more minutes to submit their questions, we can provide our stakeholders with some information about our projected timeline for setting our 2020 registry fees. Frank, I understand consultation will begin soon. Would you like to describe the process for our listeners?
Yes, we will be launching our 2020 fee consultation within a few days, right around the end of June. It's happening later than we anticipated because we were waiting to see if an electronics regulation would be available, because each of the RCEA fees is a slice of a pie, and that pie is affected by the materials that are included in the pie. So there's electronics, batteries, and tires for 2020. So we will be launching a consultation in a few days. There'll be a 45-day consultation period. The entire process will be 90 days, and then we will announce for a 30-day notice period the final results of the board's decision on setting of those fees.
Thank you. And I see no more questions, so I am going to close the question and answer portion, but I would encourage all of those online with us this morning that if you have any questions or comments you'd like to share with us following this event, please do forward them to us. The video recording of today's proceedings will be available on our website early next week. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to opportunities to continue our collaboration with you over the coming year. Thank you.
This concludes our presentation today. Everyone have a wonderful week.